This is The Blockchain Show. The Blockchain Show is a podcast that demystifies and promotes widespread adoption of cryptocurrencies and distributed ledger technology. You're listening to episode number 53. Today on the show, we have Robert Phoenix. Robert is one of my personal favorite astrologers. He does a show called The 11th House. He has 25 shows on Gaia and has been featured regularly on Regina Meredith's Conscious Media Network. You can find him on robertphoenix.com. Welcome, Robert. I'm really grateful you're on the show.
Yeah, hi. So thanks. I'm happy to be here.
So a while back, it was episode 32, I believe, on The Blockchain Show. I, in my novice naivete, just for fun, wanted to do Bitcoin's chart. Some folks are a little more receptive to it than others, but that's neither here nor there. I think I had maybe chosen the wrong date though. My co-host Steve was challenging me a little bit on the date. And in my interpretation, I thought, oh, well, the white paper seems like it was the time that, bam, Bitcoin came on the scene. But instead, I'm noticing, and other people are saying that it is more likely the Genesis block. And you have looked at that chart. Not only that, you've prepared all sorts of interesting material for us.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was a really interesting process to mine these charts using sort of the vernacular here. So the first chart I did was the Bitcoin chart. And where I actually located that chart was not Japan, but was Phoenix, Arizona, which is the hometown of the guy that did the first Bitcoin transaction, whose name escapes me right now. But I thought this would be an interesting kind of moment in time because he's the first human outside of Satoshi who has a Bitcoin exchange.
I didn't even know that.
Yeah, the first person who did a Bitcoin transaction was Hal Finney. And Hal Finney was a developer and a very early supporter of Bitcoin. And I looked up where he lives, and it's in Phoenix, Arizona. So he downloaded the Bitcoin software the day it was released and received 10 Bitcoins from Nakamoto in the world's first Bitcoin transaction. So I used Phoenix, Arizona for the place because yes, the blockchain comes online on the 3rd of January in 2009 at 6:15 p.m. This is the time that I have, and I'm assuming that Finney was right behind the opening and maybe right there. Like he probably got an email which was like, "Go do it." So when I look at this chart, it makes complete sense to me because we have Cancer on the ascendant. So just for people out there who don't know anything about astrology, the ascendant is called the rising sign. It's like the first breath. So this would be the first transaction of Bitcoin. What's really interesting right now is that as I'm speaking, the moon is in Cancer and it is conjuncting Bitcoin's ascendant or Bitcoin's rising sign. So this is kind of an interesting moment in time just from the fact that we're talking about this. Now, the rising sign is how we view the world around, or how people view us, how people see us. So, for instance, if you're a Leo rising, people see you as being kind of larger than life. Maybe you've got long hair, one of the signature kind of Leo signs. If you're Scorpio rising, maybe you're kind of dark and guarded and cloudy, and not cloudy, but dark and guarded and kind of intense. So Cancer is a very interesting rising sign because when we get into Cancer, what are we talking about? We're talking about nurturing. We're talking about building. We're talking about growing. We're talking about something that has an organic nature. It is what we call primary water in an astrological chart, meaning it's the first water sign that we encounter. So one of the things that's also really interesting about Cancer is that Cancer is very much of kind of a fiduciary sign. You know, if you hang around a Cancer long enough, you'll find that they're pretty good with facts and figures, pretty good with money. And while it's not the same kind of money that Taurus is, because when we think of money, we think of Taurus in the second house and metals and physical stuff, right? Cancer is much more engaged in something that has flow between it. It's the sign for Cancer is the yin and the yang. That's what it looks like. It's the yin and the yang. And in many cases, it also has to do with birth, because it is related to mothers and cycles and the feminine. So here we go. This is the birth of the moment. It's the birth of Bitcoin. Now, what's really interesting about this chart is that we have what's called mutual reception taking place. Because on the midheaven of the chart, which is the point of contact with the world at large, right, we have Aries on that midheaven. And where's the moon at this point in time? It's in Aries. So we have the moon in Aries right on the midheaven. So the moon is playing a very interesting role in the inception for Bitcoin, both on the ascendant and on the midheaven, where the moon is actually sort of taking up residence. So Bitcoin has a bit of a lunar quality to it, even though the time of Bitcoin and the inception of Bitcoin in the day is very Capricornian. The sun is in Capricorn, Mars is in Capricorn, and Pluto is in Capricorn. We'll get into that stuff. And that's part of Bitcoin's birth into the world. And Capricorn has everything to do with governments and big business and corporations.
May I? Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
You know, interesting that you say, because I think that's very fascinating, because it is Capricorn in nature as well, but then it has the maternal, so that's like the paternal. My father was a Capricorn and fabulous with money. And Cancer is sort of the maternal side of money, but I just learned recently that the word money comes from Juno Moneta, the Greek goddess, who was it was meant to be a tool to nurture people.
That's correct. Absolutely. And what's really fascinating is along those lines, the moon in Aries it's a hot moon. It's a passionate moon. But yet it's not passionate in the same way like the sun is. You know, the sun is blazing, it's direct. The moon is much more subtle in some ways, but in Aries, that subtlety is suffused with the Aries quality of will. So we're dealing with a couple of really interesting layers of emotion. Aries is breaking new ground. It's pioneering. That's what Aries does. So this is perfect for this chart on the midheaven, which is the world. And yet, with the moon there, it's not necessary, because the way Bitcoin has been, in my estimation, you can share your experience with me if you want, or your perception. But there's always been kind of this underground kind of feel to Bitcoin. It's very lunar in some ways. Mm-hmm. It's not like it's, does it grab headlines? Yes, of course it does. But there's this mysterious component to Bitcoin. Mm-hmm. And so when we think of that mystery, we think of the moon, and it's the moon at a quarter phase here. So it's an active moon, and it's gaining ascendancy and power. So with Aries, there's this energy that people want to be involved with it in some ways on a personal level. But the moon also creates a bit of a sense of mystery. And how do I do it? How do I get there? What's it all about? So those are my first initial impressions. And there's totally a lot more that we can get into.
Also, that brings about a bit of courage, I would hope, because we're all going to need a little bit of courage.
Well, I think so. I mean, we're stepping off in this time. We're stepping off into areas that there's no. I mean, we're getting to a period where there's no maps, and that's like across the board. Mm-hmm. Whether it's money, whether it's politics, geopolitics, whether it's the AI stuff, we're that map. That roadmap has run out. We've come to the end of that that highway.
Like Thelma and Louise.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, so where we're going now, we're creating new maps, but these are not like linear maps. These are not like point A to point B. These are maps that are connecting on a number of different levels and could be theoretically interpreted in a number of different ways, because obviously there are going to be people who are going to be, like, say, for Bitcoin, which might have some like 6 degrees of separation with AI. And there are going to be some people who are going to be much more open to AI. Mm-hmm. And they say, oh, yeah, this sounds great. Why wouldn't I do that? It's going to make my life easier. Mm-hmm. And there are going to be people like, oh, no, I don't want anything having to do with AI. I don't want to have anything to do with Bitcoin because, I want something tangible, fungible, material in my hands. So when we get to this point, there's going to be, various interpretations and various directions and ways to go. So we're getting to high level novelty in terms of who we are as individuals and as a collective. And the high level novelty is going to challenge us in terms of how we're going to interact with all this brand new material, which theoretically is what's being termed as the fourth industrial revolution. Mm-hmm. And Bitcoin clearly is a part of this, what they call the fourth industrial revolution.
That's really fascinating to me on how you discovered that you chose this particular time as, I love how you put it, that Bitcoin took its first breath. That was really its first first exchange. And so it would be the first. Yeah.
Well, so the time was there, right? The time was there. We know what that time was, but in order to set the ascendant, we needed a place, we needed a location. And so I just looked up where Hal Finney, who was the first person to have a transaction with Bitcoin, and where they live. And Phoenix is kind of an interesting place. I mean, from a symbolic perspective, like it is rising out of the ashes of something.
Very clever,
right?
Yeah. Right.
It's also one of those cities that are at that 33rd degree parallel, not only in the United States, but going around the world. And that 33rd degree parallel is really, really fascinating. Of course, JFK shot in Dallas at 32 degrees, and you've got Hollywood basically right at 32 degrees, and Phoenix is right in there. So it's a pretty powerful degree. And there's a lot of other things that have happened around the 33rd. I think Martin Luther King was killed in was it Mobile, and that's not very far from the 33rd degree parallel either. So there's a lot happening. And,
is this I'm sorry to interrupt you on this 33 degree parallel. Is that the sort of level where, let's say, that volcano is on Mars and where the big storm is on Jupiter? There's something about the nature of our planets that.
Certainly there is an alignment with Phoenix at the 33rd degree parallel with Cydonia on Mars. Yes. So where there's an alignment with Phoenix and Cydonia. Now, I'd have to go into my, let's just look at this for a second here, 33rd degree parallel. We'll do this kind of a real-time thing. So the 33rd degree parallel, we're going to get into so Dallas is at 32, which is right near, it's like right off that cusp. Let's see what else. Okay, so San Clemente is at the 33rd degree parallel, and that's where Richard Nixon lived, in San Clemente. Dallas, Fort Worth, through Texas, of course. And then what else do we have? We have LaGrange, Georgia, and then in other parts of the world, Japan has a number of cities around. Nagasaki is at the 33rd degree parallel. That's pretty interesting. And then Tibet is at the 33rd degree parallel. There you go. A number of Chinese cities, but Tibet is at the 33rd degree parallel. And let's see.
Is that a dragon line?
Yeah,
or a ley line?
One of them. Yeah. And Kashmir in Pakistan is at the. So there's and we could drill down even further. It's a very interesting alignment. And Phoenix is just right. It's just kind of right there. I think Phoenix is roughly at 32. So it's Arizona is on that 33, and so Phoenix is certainly in there. Anyway, I just found it was an interesting place to have that first transaction because it's sort of the beginning of the old and the beginning or the end of the old, beginning of the new. Yeah. So what's really okay? So if you want to drill down even further with this is what's fascinating about Bitcoin and separates it to my understanding, or at least perception, around Ethereum. And Ethereum's chart is very complicated, by the way. It's very, very complicated. But Bitcoin's chart is very clean. And in astrology, there are 7 different types of charts. They're called the Jones types. And Bitcoin's chart is almost a classic sort of wide bundle with a Saturn sort of handle. It's almost like what they call a T-spout chart, which is meaning that there's kind of like the cup, and then there's the end of the chart, which comes out sort of at the bottom part of the chart. It's not quite a classic sort of T-spout chart, but it also has a cluster element, meaning that there are a number of planets that are really bunched together very close in a specific area. And those planets range from Pluto at the first degree of Capricorn all the way to Venus at the 0 degree of Pisces. So we have this kind of cluster node. And what's really interesting about that kind of assemblage is that when we get out of Sagittarius, which is the sign before Capricorn, Sagittarius is it's sort of the beginning of the last quadrant of the chart. So there are 3 quadrants of the charts. Four houses times 3. So Sagittarius for 4 signs times 3. So Sagittarius represents the last quadrant, and all those quadrants have to deal with transpersonal information, transpersonal interaction, and transpersonal transactions. It's very different, Sagittarius to Pisces, than, say, Aries to Leo. And the reason why is because Aries to Leo is really personal. You're dealing with personal matter. You're dealing with the self with Aries. You're dealing with money, assets, Taurus, hardcore kind of material values. You're dealing with communication, how to learn, how to think, how to relate to another person, Gemini. You're dealing with emotions on a fundamental personal level in what you absorb from your home environment. That's Cancer, right? Leo is your first love, So this is where, in hobbies, this is a delineation of that personal sort of quadrant, Aries to Cancer. When we get to, it's actually Aries to Gemini, but we can go Aries to Cancer. And then when we get to those final three signs, Capricorn, Aquarius, and Pisces, we are moving so far away from the personal because Capricorn represents the world, right? It is, Capricorn is, we could spend an hour on Capricorn. Capricorn is the world. It's also Baphomet. Capricorn is the hyper-dimensional black Saturn cube. That's what Capricorn is. It is ruled by Saturn, which can be translated literally into Satan. When you come into this planet, when you come into this world, you are making a deal with Saturn and Capricorn, and you deal with restrictions and limitations. That's the nature of Capricorn. Mm-hmm. So this is where we delineate and represent those institutions that are incredibly Capricornian, business and corporations. That's your Capricornian kind of assemblage of energies, right?
And so that's how they got their bad name, Satan?
Well, who's that?
Well, the businesses and the corporations they're...
Well, I think they got their bad name, yeah, because when you get into Capricorn, what do you get into? You get into abuse of power, right? It's power corrupts absolutely. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. And Capricorn is the world. It's the world. And when you get into the world, you're dealing with energies that are like you can find the divine through this world, but this world is not necessarily the seat. It's not necessarily the seat of the divine. Let's put it that way.
Uh-huh.
You know, it is the domain of powers and principles, right? You know, which is what is talked about in the Bible. This is what we're dealing with in this realm, and so we have to make a deal with it in some ways. Not that we're making a deal with the devil, but you know, when you feel like if you're really conscious and you pay taxes, you know where those taxes theoretically, you may not know exactly where they're going, but theoretically you know where they're going. But those taxes are going to what? Create bombs that are going to maim people in other countries. Mm-hmm. Those taxes go towards what? Paying off lobbyists from other countries in very favor. You're doing a deal with the devil when you do your taxes. That's kind of what I'm talking about. And yet you do it anyway, correct? Because it's one of the limitations and lamentations of this world. So this is what Capricorn brings to us in our charts, in our individual charts in our lives. And in this chart, it's in the 6th house. 12 houses, 6th house, purpose, service, work, and dharma. So this is Capricorn in a place that is not exalted per se. If it was exalted, it would be in the 10th house. And again, I'm dealing with a time and a location based on what I was able to, put together. And it makes sense in a lot of ways because the 6th house is not necessarily a sexy house. That's Virgo's house. Right? It's Virgo's house.
Service.
So here we have these Capricornian energies in service of what? In service of people like yourself and other people who are trying or attempting or working on being able to ground something that has been tapped into by who or what? The elite, right? The elite, the power structures, the bankers, the corporations. In the 6th house, this makes Bitcoin theoretically much more accessible. Much more accessible. Mm-hmm. Of course, you have to use 6th house kinds of techniques to get to it.
What does that mean?
What are those? Yeah, so you got to mine Bitcoins, right? You got to mine them. So that's a very 6th house kind of thing. You've got to engage with it on a kind of consistent and continual basis. Mm-hmm. That's a very 6th house application. You know, the 6th house is related to the people that do the dirty work in this world. You know, whether they mix your drink or make your latte or change your oil, that's very 6th house stuff. Mm-hmm. So we're taking something that is connected to, you know, this kind of elite strata in Capricorn, the 10th house, and it's now living in the 6th house where you've got to engage with it on kind of a fundamental level. It's not as fundamental as Taurus, but it's still fundamental. And there is so there's kind of how do I say this? But there's also a feeling of democratization with the 6th house. Like when we think about the former Soviet Union, right, and the People's Party, the Workers' Party, it's a very 6th house kind of deal. You know, everybody's got some skin in the game in that theoretical paradigm. Mm-hmm. Everybody's kind of a 6th house person. You're doing it out of service, the service of the state. So we have Pluto there, we have Mars there, and we have the Sun there. And even if we extract those 3 planets from that house, that is a really potent combination.
Wait a minute. Are you saying that the Sun's in Capricorn? That's
right.
What are you talking about when you say that then? What Sun?
Well, the Sun, but Pluto is also in Capricorn, and Mars is in Capricorn too. So and it's like the first degree of Pluto in Capricorn. And when we, during that time, this is also when, interestingly enough, when the economy went to hell. So we have some interesting things going on. You know, we have all this negatively amortized debt, right? They were basically trading on, for all intents and purposes, fiduciary cancer cells. Mm-hmm. That's what they were collateralizing, right?
Well said.
Yeah, and so And so at that time now, here comes this other energy coming into play. And it's at the inception, which is the first degree of Pluto in Capricorn. So this is very transformative, very, very transformative. And Mars brings energy and action. That's the nature of Mars. You bring Pluto and Mars together, and we're talking about something that is incredibly, incredibly potent and dynamic. This is a really interesting combination of Mars-Pluto. And again, located in the sixth house, it brings it kind of a more democratized and to some degree accessible. Like, for instance, if you wanted to become an oligarch, right? If you really want to become, maybe now it's a little bit more difficult. Let's say you got into Bitcoin in the first year and you had 100 Bitcoins. How much would you be worth now? It would be staggering, right? Mm-hmm. And this is what was kind of the opening at that point in time. And it's still there. We're dealing with this whole idea of blockchain, and I'm still wrapping my head around blockchain, still learning about it. So if I sound perhaps a bit naive, I apologize. I'm just looking at this from the astrological perspective. So this is the other thing too, is that Jupiter was also in Capricorn at that time, and Jupiter is expansion, and it represents opportunity. So here we have Jupiter at the final degree of Capricorn, 29th degree. In astrology, that's called an anaretic degree. So in essence, there is something about Bitcoin that has to deal with not necessarily Bitcoin as a standalone currency or a standalone economy or even a standalone sort of form of consciousness. But at the 29th degree, it represents kind of the last outpost of this Capricornian relationship with resources and this kind of top-down hierarchy that we've been dealing with for a very, very long time. So there's something about this Jupiter that says that we have to pay, I wouldn't necessarily say homage to this system, but there's something about that degree where it might even indicate that the forces that have been running the planets and running the money game, right, that they may wind up having to hang on to the nth degree of their system. That's another kind of potentiality that's connected to this. It's not just Bitcoin, but it's also the bankers and the corporations and the corporocratic kind of network that is trying to hold on to that last vestige of, whatever it is, whatever story. Control is part of it, but it's I think it's a huge part of it. But it's also like Capricorn, also because it's opposite Cancer. It's not necessarily indistinct from Cancer. Cancer, we're looking to the past. It's all about nostalgia. In Capricorn, we're looking to the future. It's like poised, looking out to the rest of the solar system, right? So with Jupiter there, especially in opposition to the ascendants that I have here for this chart, there is this sense of, I wouldn't really call it nostalgia, but it's like, well, this is the way that we've done things. Mm-hmm. We've done these things for this amount of time. But they're really, this is, whether it's gold or hard assets or fractional reserve lending or funny money, whatever. So there's part of this that's going on with this Jupiter and Capricorn. But and there's obviously, a whole lot more. That 29th degree is like really, really intense because you can't, it's almost like a do not pass go sign. So there's potentiality because Jupiter expands everything. But at the same time, there's this interesting gap between, and it's not very far because now we have a discussion about Aquarius. And this is where Bitcoin for me gets really interesting I mean, it's already interesting, but from an astrological perspective, we have Mercury, which is communication. We have the true node, which represents like sort of the true north of the chart, or the true north of the experience for an individual, or whatever we're looking at for in terms of the event. The true node is an essential part of the chart. It is the ascending plane of the moon, and when we look at the true node, that is where it's like the tip of the arrow. That's where you need to go in the chart. And so in this case, what are we dealing with? It's the true node in Aquarius. So Bitcoin is connected to this unfoldment of this next level of where we're going, whether you like it or not, whether you're into it or not, whether you're on board or not. We've got 4 planets that are all in the sign of Aquarius: Mercury, true node, Chiron, and Neptune. So they're all representative of this next wave of evolution. It's really interesting because we have that Jupiter in Capricorn at 29 degrees, the anaretic degree, and then we have this kind of push for this new system, or this new and novel way of associating with something from a collective perspective. And from that point forward, you're dealing with Venus in Pisces and Uranus in Pisces. So for the most part, Bitcoin is operating under the majority of 3 signs: Capricorn, Aquarius, and Pisces. Moon is in Aries, and also Saturn is in the sign of Virgo, which is also in the 3rd house, or it's in the 3rd house. So when we look at astrology in general, and we look at the path and the pattern of the chart, when you start off, you're in the 1st house and you take your first breath and you're born. And then you go around from each and every house after that, and there's a level of personal and social development. By the time you get to the 10th house in your own life, as the chart relates to your own life, it's the height. It's like the high noon of your life. And that's where you're working, and that's where you're making money, and that's where you're making a reputation. And it's kind of like roughly from, just after the Saturn return, 30 to about 65. So about a 35-year span in that 10th house, traditionally. And then what happens when you're done? After that, you basically move into your 11th house, which is Aquarius. You move out of work, the house of hopes and dreams and wishes. You hang out with groups of people. Maybe you go down to, I don't know, the VFW or whatever, right? Which is a very Aquarian thing. Or maybe you want to get back. You've done really, really well with your 10th house life. You have some money, so you want to be philanthropic and you want to get involved and on that level. So that's where the individual consciousness or the individual's biological evolution takes that. And then the house after that is Pisces. And by that time, you're down by the lake, you're down by the river, you're watching kind of life go by at that level. And then you're getting ready to leave, right? You're getting ready to move out of the chart again and, become one with the eternal circle of life. So we know this from the individual level. And when we look at Bitcoin, it's coming in it's not coming in, it's got the moon in Aries, yes, but it's not coming in at Aries. It's not coming in at that elemental level. Mm-hmm. It's coming in fully born in Capricorn. Mm-hmm. So not only is it coming in fully born in Capricorn, but it's representing the final 3 stages of the evolution of the individual chart, and even the evolution of where we're headed. Because right now, we're getting ready to move out of this Capricornian phase. We're getting ready to move out of this whole idea and notion of government and corporations. And with the inception of AI and the technology that's coming, whether you like it or not, whether you can manage it or not, that is the birth of the Aquarian age. And we're
the real Aquarian age, right?
Well, yes. I mean, it could be very dark too. Don't get me wrong. There's a dark version of the Aquarian age,
which is like present, I would think.
Yeah, it's a techno-feudal society where there are a very small group of people who have amassed a huge amount of power and basically run everything. on a planetary grid. I mean, that's really what the dark Aquarian age is about. Mm-hmm. It's a techno-feudalism. And even in that arena, there's the possibility that they would amplify, theoretically, their ability to think or act, or they'd augment themselves, which would kind of amplify the relationship. We haven't even gotten into like the AI stuff. This is all coming, right? There's a layer underneath that. There's a layer underneath that where there could be a much more kind of democratic relationship with technology, and much more disturbing. And when I say disturbing, I don't mean disturbing like human chimeras walking around, making espressos for you, but disturbing in the sense
disrupting.
Disruptive. Thank you. It could be much more disruptive, and I think that could be really interesting. And I think that Bitcoin, and I still have some questions about where it's all going, right? Because money's going away. Money's going to go away, mm-hmm. and that's a fait accompli. Mm-hmm. In 2018, Uranus goes into Taurus, which would be an interesting moment for Bitcoin, because when Uranus goes into Taurus in May, it's going to be trining Bitcoin's Pluto in Capricorn at 1 degree. It could be huge. But and what does it mean in terms of its Donald Trumpism, right? It means that it could be something that would potentially not only change people's lives that are involved in the system, but change the world as we know it in terms of how we transact. And it remains to be seen if it is going to be something that will be co-opted. It becomes sort of the coin of the realm as it relates to digital transactions and all the biometrics that go along with that. Because there's kind of I wouldn't call them Luddites, but certainly there are people that are more on the paranoid tip who see Bitcoin as being like the currency of the beast, right? I mean, there's discussion about this.
I flat out heard it was some tech insider video that I saw on Facebook today where some woman was saying that it was all made by bad guys on the internet.
Right. But what's interesting about Bitcoin is that it's created a revolution. I mean, we can see this astrologically with Mercury in Aquarius and the true node in Aquarius. It is a revolutionary system for transactions. But it's not the only one. I mean, obviously, I'm looking at Ethereum's chart, and there are a number of different blockchains. Even Goldman Sachs, right, has created its own blockchain, to be a bridge between transactions. Mm-hmm. What's called settle something. Anyway, so Bitcoin, with all the Aquarian elements here, has created a revolution. And it's going to be very, very interesting. Now, one of the things that I do see here coming up for Bitcoin in the not-so-distant future is that the transiting south node is going to be conjuncting Bitcoin's Chiron. And that could represent a vulnerability.
Chiron is super interesting. I was hoping you were going to talk about that, because I thought, what an interesting. Well, for me, I mean, this is just how when I heard that Bitcoin's Chiron was in Aquarius, it was my instant reaction to that. And I am not. And I learned from you about Chiron, but the first thing that I had thought of was, oh, what a beautiful new pair of glasses to see this through, as opposed to I think I was so hardened and irritated and angry at the I guess like what I've come to know as the pseudo Aquarian age, or the like you said, perfectly technological feudalism or whatever that was, just the uber controlling, the shadow. I call it the shadow side of Aquarius.
Absolutely.
And when I thought, oh, the Chiron is in Aquarius, that's almost beautiful because maybe instead of me looking at it like, yeah, this thing's going to slay that ugly beast, it's more like healing the Aquarian injury or wound.
I love that. I love that. That's very insightful. The other thing that, I was born with Chiron in Aquarius, so, I have a little bit of insight into this aspect. And for people that are not really conversant or fluent in astrology, and there are even people that are, mildly conversant in fluent in astrology, they don't know what Chiron is. And I just want to give, without having a huge dissertation, Chiron is like a cross between a planetoid and a comet. And it's hanging out between Saturn and Uranus, and it actually has an orbit. They discovered it in 1977. And
very good year.
Because of its relationship between Saturn and Uranus, it is this entity, right? This kind of planetary entity that bridges the Saturnian world of doing the right thing, being disciplined and structured and ordered, and getting the right job and you're going to the right school, all those Saturnian things, right? And on the other side of Chiron is Uranus, which is explosive, it's radical, it's disruptive. So it's this kind of midpoint between the two of them. And so what we do throughout all of our lives is we do this dance between order and chaos, Saturn and Uranus. And Chiron is the arbiter of this experience in our lives. And every now and then, if we're too far on the order side, the chaos will come in, and Chiron will usually play a role. So we become unstuck from our routine. For some people, they can be really, really Uranian. And so Chiron comes in and says, look, brother, you got to get yourself some Saturn. You got to get a job, you got to settle down, you got to get some structure, order in your life. Get off of the Uranian, synchronistic, everything's out there trip. And so most people tend to be, or have tended to be, Saturnian. So the challenge is the Uranian side of Chiron, like leaving your job or leaving your marriage or leaving your family and beginning to take the road less traveled, right? Mm-hmm. Chiron is also this character from Greek mythology, and he's a centaur, and he was born out of the relationship between Kronos and a nymph from the ocean. I think her name was Oceana. I believe she's an ocean nymph, and so Kronos, he basically becomes a white stallion, and she says, "Oh yeah, I want to be with this white stallion."
Those Greeks, they had the most interesting wooing choices.
Oh, I know, right? Yeah, let's. So, anyways, he becomes this white stallion, and she becomes pregnant, and she gives birth to this half horse, half human. He's a centaur, and she becomes mortified. She rejects him outright. She says, you're not my kid. So what happens? He what does he experience? He experiences shame. So Chiron is one of these astrological components that has kind of a unique meaning, and shame is one of them that comes right to the surface because that's the immediate reaction. Chiron actually has it pretty good because he's raised by Apollo and Artemis, right? So he's got sort of the best of breed in terms of being raised, and so he learns archery, and he learns poetry, and he learns medicine, and he learns astrology and divination. He becomes a really well-rounded centaur, okay? And he winds up becoming also the teacher of, all the heroes of the Iliad. He becomes their teacher. So Chiron is a really evolved kind of being, but he has to get through the pain. And it's the pain of rejection. The pain of rejection and shame. So once you get through that, it's very, very liberating. And so it's called the wounded healer because Chiron was also the healer who healed Achilles, his Achilles heel. He's also the healer of Prometheus, believe it or not. Prometheus, he couldn't stand Prometheus watching his liver getting pecked out every single day. And so Chiron said to the gods, he said, look, I'm tired of watching this happen. Put me there. I'll take it. I'll take the pain. So the gods said, well, if you do that, you'll lose your immortal status. And Chiron says, I don't care. So he's actually the redeemer of Prometheus.
What a hero.
Right. Yeah. So, but Chiron is quite interesting in Aquarius because Aquarius is, of course, unusual. And Chiron is healing, and you're absolutely right. It's healing this Aquarian model. You know, when I get into astrology, or one of my little things is I look at Chiron from a generational perspective and even past life perspective, right? So when I look at Chiron and Aquarius, and Chiron has, in your regular orbit, there, like Chiron in Libra was about 1.5 years, really strange. And other Chirons have lasted about 7 years, and it's usually about a 50-year orbit. So Chiron in Aquarius, to me, because I'm part of it, and I kind of have sort of played with this model, is that this is very Atlantean. These are Atlantean energies with Chiron and Aquarius. And so there are people who are born under this aspect, Chiron and Aquarius, who are basically Atlantean healers, or here to heal that which went south or sideways in Atlantis. So here we have Chiron in Aquarius in the Bitcoin chart. Now, are there any echoes of Atlantis here with this? You know, how did they exchange money? I mean, we don't really know. It's a speculation to some degree, unless you're a channel. But there's some interesting echoes here from other times, potentially. You know, the antediluvian, sort of prehistorical, and not prehistorical in the sense that we're talking about, you know, dinosaurs and mastodons or whatever, but prehistorical in the sense that it does not match sort of the map of time that we have now. So is there a relationship with that? And if so, could it actually be something that has the potential of healing, which is what you were getting at, sort of this darkness that is descending sort of around us, whether it's through the dark AI or whether it's through, you know, 14-year-old kids getting addicted to their screens or whatever. Is there a way for this to become this disruptive yet healing entity that becomes, you know, really democratic? Because that's what Aquarius is. It's very, very democratic.
It's also a bit punk rock, isn't it?
It is punk rock, totally punk rock. But it's punk rock in the sense that punk rock is really democratic, right?
Yeah.
In a true sense.
Yeah.
In a true sense, right? So, but yeah, it is. It's totally punk rock. And I guess is Bitcoin punk rock? Probably. It's a punk rock.
It's got to have a little punk rock in it. You got to stand up to those crusties, and you know.
Yeah, yeah. So it's a very
interesting
chart. Now, the one thing about the chart that is that besides all the Aquarian material, which is in the 8th house, by the way, the 8th house is other people's money, which I think is interesting, right? So you have these Aquarian, Chiron and Neptune and other people's money. That's where banking goes down in a lot of cases. It's the 8th house. And Venus is there in Pisces. And that's a really interesting place for Venus. Because Pisces, you know, it starts off, right, with this hardcore kind of Capricornian intensity. Pluto, Mars, the Sun. I can't think of any 3 more intense planets than Pluto, Mars, and the Sun, to be honest with you. And they're all hanging out in Capricorn. This is the birth of Bitcoin. And then it morphs into that, into the kind of that Aquarian sort of piece where it's like, okay, here it is. It's available for everybody. And it's technological, which is also very Aquarian. And then it moves into Pisces, which is a very different energy, especially Venus and Pisces. So it's this relationship with Venus, because Venus represents relationship with something that is transcendent. It's transcendent. So I know this is kind of maybe a wild thought or a crazy thought, but what if Bitcoin is not just a disruptive economy or a disruptive monetary system or disruptive technology, but what if Bitcoin is actually something that is an agency of the divine? This is an interesting thought.
I absolutely think so. And I have to tell you, my number one reason for wholeheartedly agreeing with you is that I'm interested in it. I'm as Pisces as it gets. And I'm doing a show about money. There must be some divine intervention.
I think so. This is, and I never really kind of thought of Bitcoin in this way. But when we get into Pisces, we're moving, we're not in this world anymore. Right?
That's for sure.
We're trying to map out, not even map out. We're exploring this space where we're dissolving.
Mm-hmm.
And Venus and Pisces is the relationship between us and this world, and whatever realm is kind of beyond this, whether it's a Bardo or whether it's some sort of atheist coffee club or whatever's beyond this, right? This is the realm of Pisces. So, and Venus is saying there's a relationship here with something that is transcendent. And I just keep looking at, in some ways, kind of the brilliance of the birth of this day. It just jumps right in at Capricorn. It takes us to Aquarius, and then it moves us out to Pisces. And then the last stop is the moon, which is right there on the midheaven in Aries. And that, to me, is that where it's all going? Is that where this evolutionary kind of piece with Bitcoin is taking us, or is it the thing that grabs us and says, "Hey, I'm really interested in that. Mm-hmm. I could get passionate about that. It's mysterious. I want to find out more."
Mm-hmm.
So, of course, there's a lot more. I mean, we could spend a lot of time on this. Saturn's in the third house, and that's again with this chart, it's communication.
Oh, that makes all the sense in the world.
Yeah, and it's in Virgo, right? So it's kind of rigorous, it's detail oriented, and there's an opposition with Saturn and Uranus, which is fascinating, right? Because Uranus represents what? The world to come. Uranus is the future. Uranus is technology, and it's opposing Saturn, which is kind of the old way of doing things. This is a really interesting part of this chart, is the Uranus-Saturn opposition. So, this is fascinating. I'm really happy that you brought me on to talk about this chart, because it's really interesting. Now, I have to say, with the South Node coming around and getting ready to conjunct the Chiron here in Aquarius, that what we might see, and this is apparently, I read this with, I'm sure you're up on all this stuff, but this thing with Ethereum, where they had a breach and they went in to fix it and they lost $300 million, right? You know this, right?
Yes.
Right. So I'm just finding out about this stuff. But I'm not saying that Bitcoin's going to have a breach, but there's a vulnerability coming to Bitcoin, and it's going to be coming within the next 2 months. Within the next 2 months, and after the first of the year. Now, that vulnerability may not be technological, although I wouldn't rule that out. But the vulnerability might be something that would be more akin to, from a social level.
Right.
Where all of a sudden they say, screw this, we want to get into your, let's say all of a sudden the Saudis, who are really hurting for money, and they're arresting all their cousins now, right? maybe they're really hurting for money, and all of a sudden they see something that is vulnerable for Bitcoin or the blockchain, and they go after it. I'm not saying that that's going to happen, but there's something coming here after the first of the year where there's a vulnerability to Bitcoin. And, Bitcoin's got its true node in Aquarius. So there's going to be something that's challenging the model here because it's going through the nodal opposition. And I'm sure it'll be fine. I mean, but it could be one of those things where they want to clamp down on the anonymity and the ubiquity of it. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this is where I think this could go. Anyway, it's a very fascinating chart, and I'm glad you asked me to come on the show and talk about it. And
likewise.
I mean, we could look at the Ethereum chart if you want. I'm happy to do that. It's a much more complicated chart, and in some ways, it's not as interesting as Bitcoin. However, there are some, what I would call some overlaps with the chart. For instance, Ethereum is it's a Leo technology. It's a Leo, point of distribution or blockchain. So and when we get into Leo, it's like there's more. How do I say? There's more personality involved in it,
mm-hmm.
and it's like with Bitcoin, you get into Capricorn. There's not much personality with Capricorn. It's systems. It's systems. It's kind of rigorous. It's kind of cold in some ways, and it's very very professional. There's something about the Ethereum which is much more invested in personality with Leo, and there's also kind of an Aquarian element to Ethereum, in that the Moon, which is in Libra here, and Venus in Virgo, and the true node in Virgo are in the 11th house of the chart, and that's Aquarius's house. So it too has an Aquarian thrust, but it is this system, Ethereum, is going to go through. Like it's got a grand cross in the chart, all right. So when you have a grand cross in the chart, you're dealing with four 90-degree angles, which is a square, and then you have oppositions inside of it.
Mm-hmm.
And in the chart of an individual as a grand cross, that's like a heavy chart to deal with. That's a person that's going to have a lot of challenges, and the big payout for the individual chart is that they can get a lot of mastery in this lifetime, but have to deal with a lot of shit. And so this is what's happening in the Ethereum chart. There's all kinds of challenges in this chart. And in the Bitcoin chart, the only real challenge that I see, or the squares, are from Saturn to Pluto, which is not insignificant, by the way, because you're dealing with old school Saturn and Pluto and transforming the old school
mm-hmm.
through the square. You're dealing with the Moon square to Pluto, Moon square to Mars, and Moon square to the Sun. And that has a lot to do with how people feel about this emotionally, right? And squaring off against things like, when you get into Moon-Pluto square, it's about attachments and holding on. And, they may hold on to an old way of doing things. They may hold on to, some component of Bitcoin that, maybe serves them at one point in time, and maybe it's time to get out. There tends to be kind of more of a public kind of perception with the Moon and squaring off against the actual mechanism where it came from, all that stuff. The other thing, too, about Bitcoin, before I go over to Ethereum, is this Satoshi guy.
Satoshi Nakamoto?
Yeah, right. So from the perspective of the Bitcoin chart, when we get into Pisces is very mysterious. And this guy's kind of mysterious from what I've been able to gather.
He's completely mysterious.
Yeah. So this is interesting, this Piscean element, especially in the 8th house of this chart. But with the Ethereum stuff, I just want to get back to the Ethereum thing. Ethereum seems like it's got more challenges. It's got some interesting aspects because of the true node, Venus, Moon in Aquarius, the 11th house, which makes it, more group, more public, more tech. It's kind of the same thing to some degree with the assemblage of planets in Aquarius for Bitcoin. But the difference is these squares. Like, again, this thing that just happened where they lost, $300 million. Mm-hmm. So how does that happen in this chart? Well, for instance, there's a very different Chiron. Chiron is in Pisces in this chart.
I don't know what that means. I wouldn't know.
Well, Chiron Pisces has when we talk about Pisces, we get into talking points and keywords like fate, right? Like things just happen, with Pisces. There's no just kind of out of the blue, fated kinds of experience. Like things are supposed to happen. When we talked about astrology in the early 20th century and the late 19th century, if you had a bad chart, you were screwed. You're born under a bad sign, which is kind of like the Piscean age in some ways. But now we talk about astrology in different terms, evolutionary things. The chart is a living, breathing kind of entity.
It's information. It's information that you can use, if you want to change things if you like.
Well, it's true, and it's not damning you and dooming you, because that's the way astrology used to be. And so that's just, a very kind of, in some ways, generalized definition of Pisces. But when we get into Chiron and Pisces, we're dealing with the wound, because it's always the wound. With Chiron, it's the wound with technology. It's the wound with science. It's Chiron Aquarius is the wound with the collective. It's the wound with the individual and the collective, because Aquarius is a paradoxical sign. When we get into Chiron and Pisces, we're dealing with things like faith. We're dealing with things like, to some degree, artistry and creativity. We're dealing with addiction. We're dealing with God. We're dealing with the devil. I mean, it's all part of the Piscean bandwidth of the sacred and the profane. So Chiron in Pisces has to do with healing those things, healing your relationship with faith, healing one's relationship with addiction, healing one's relationship with a creative process, which might be very helpful in these things. So in terms of transits, transiting Neptune has been right around Chiron in Pisces. In fact, transiting Neptune as we speak is at 11 degrees. So it's been very close to Chiron inside of the Ethereum chart. So could that have been one of these things that came into play as part of this vulnerability with Ethereum? Another thing, too, is that transiting Jupiter has been right on the Ethereum ascendant. So because Ethereum is a Scorpio rising chart, it's very different. Well, different in the sense it's water, so that's the same, but Scorpio is very, very different than Cancer. Cancer wants to nurture and grow. Scorpio is about power, and it's about resources. So Jupiter has been on the Ethereum ascendant since basically the end of September, beginning of October. Right around, October. When did Harvey Weinstein get busted? He was busted on the week after Vegas, so that would be the 8th. That's when Jupiter started to hit the ascendant of the Ethereum chart, and so it expands everything. That's what Jupiter does; it expands. And theoretically, you think, okay, well, Jupiter expanding on the Ethereum ascendant would be good because it's resources, it's other people's money. But sometimes Jupiter brings an excess, and it's in its detriment, if I'm not mistaken, in Scorpio. So what we might be seeing with Ethereum is this kind of maybe excessive kind of overreach when dealing with these packets and losing $300 million as a correction to the actual breach. I as a system, I would say, even just by looking at the chart, like if I didn't even know that happened with Ethereum, I would be less, I wouldn't necessarily invest in it, but I would try to invest more in Bitcoin because Bitcoin is much more stable, just in terms of its astrological chart. The Ethereum chart is not that stable. Now, there could be great potential with the Ethereum chart, but it's going to have to go through some things, So that's what I'm seeing here.
That is a great bunch of information. Thank you for that.
You're welcome. I hope it makes sense. I mean, I don't know how your blockchain audience will relate to this information.
Neither do I.
It's probably a very, very different world, but I'm doing my best to make it relevant so they can wrap their heads around some of this and give them some context.
Right. I know that there are definitely a lot of tech-minded people out there to whom this might be very new and new language and just strange. But I'm going deeper and deeper into all the blockchain watering holes out there. I've found my people, and I've seen that there's people out there putting the chart up and talking about it, and I just loved it. It was so fun to hear people's speculations, but yours I highly respect.
Well, thank you. And what's really interesting, too, now that I think about it, I have two clients whom I really adore. They're great people, and they consult with me on a semi-frequent basis, and they're blockchain heads. They're total blockchain heads. They're totally into Bitcoin. So, just between you and these two other folks, gals, it's like, wow, this is interesting. There could be some overlap between blockchain and not just astrology, but people who are looking for kind of a reset and looking at systems in a way from a different perspective where they're new and they're fresh and innovative. So we might find there might be a few more people that might actually be into what we're talking about tonight. So.
And all in good time too. Once upon a time, I used to discount this, but it was, like I said, I told you it was a guilty pleasure of mine because I lived in a world where that wasn't very acceptable because it was just looked at as no. But of course, as what usually happens is that's the opinion coming from folks who haven't listened or looked into it. And usually what I find is somebody who's curious and open-minded can receive new information in ways that's less threatening. It's all just information, and you can take it in, or you could do it the old way.
Yeah, absolutely. When I think about it, I'm a big sports guy, and I think about metrics in baseball and how they've gotten these. Baseball is very different than, say, football or basketball because there's really individual kind of units in baseball, and you can really track those units, whereas within football, there's such a team game, it's much more difficult to track. And some of that information has revolutionized baseball, right? I mean, looking at the value of a walk versus a stolen base, the value of a strike versus a home run. Mm-hmm. And the Houston Astros, who just won the World Series, employ what's called sabermetrics. And but they don't do it to the extent that some other teams do, who live and die by the metrics. They also have kind of a human element too. They're kind of a hybridized model, which I think is interesting. So in terms of information, we can certainly, call and get bits and pieces and still, have some of the things that we have relied upon in the past and blend them. So this is an interesting time, at least I think it is, because there's so many different sort of nodes, that are, that we come in contact with, and how we can begin to decipher reality from all these different levels. And it's just such a fascinating time to be alive.
I agree.
A lot of people think it's a really dark time and a heavy time in the cat. I think we're living in an amazing time.
It's so exciting.
And, it is. It's really, really exciting. and as long as you don't get taken down by the undertow, and there's plenty out there that can do that. I mean, it seems like we're having a false flag or some sort of shooting every week now, and which is very disconcerting. And having to wade through that is kind of a pain in the ass. But there's something else that's going on, and I talked about this on my show today. Because here you and I are, right? We're having this conversation. We're talking about blockchain. We're talking about astrology. We talk about probably another half dozen topics and probably connect them all together. Where in human history have we been able to do this before? It has not been able to be done before, right? Mm-hmm. I've been talking about how on my show how Google and a number of these robotics companies are really into this deep learning, right? The deep learning for the AI. We're going through our own version of deep learning. We're going through a really radical process where we're having all these novel connections going on inside of our brains. And it's not just me, it's not just you, but it's me and it's you, and it's all these other people who are communicating, whether they're conscious of it or not, in a flow and a transmission of ideas. And I really believe we're upping our collective IQ. That's my sense. Mm-hmm. And I think it's really interesting. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And, as with most things in life, usually I won't change unless I'm in a great deal of discomfort. So there's always a purpose to everything, isn't there?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And that's when you get sick, right? Your body's sick. What are you going to do? Well, I got to change my diet. Mm-hmm. Well, you probably could have changed your diet 2 years ago, but you had to get to a place where you change your diet, and it's unfortunate, but it's true. And maybe that's why we're here. We have to deal with those kinds of intense limitations and then break through them. Mm-hmm. Yeah, even if they're self-imposed.
Often are. Well, Robert, again, for the millionth time, I thank you for your great insight on Bitcoin's chart.
Well, you're welcome. And like I said, I'm not like I'm attached to people liking what I say, but I hope some people out there find it interesting because I certainly did. It's a fascinating chart. And maybe what I could do is actually write it up on my website and break it down. I think I'll do that. I think that's going to be my homework on this end.
Awesome. If you need some artwork for it, I'll be happy to provide.
That sounds great. So thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Are you looking for an easy way to buy Bitcoin or Ether on a safe, secure platform? Coinbase is the easiest place to buy and sell digital currencies. Sign up today as a friend of the Blockchain Show, and if you buy or sell $100 of Bitcoin or more, you'll earn $10 of free Bitcoin for yourself and $10 of Bitcoin to support this show. Join now using the link in this episode's show notes at theblockchainshow.com.